hopefully get some slides up here. All right. The foreclosure crisis, where millions of families have lost their homes over the past 6 years, is spurring the growth of a militant movement across the U.S. and the globe. This week in Spain, the moratorium on evictions was won in the midst of a general strike sweeping across Europe. And here in the U.S., the movement against foreclosures and evictions is growing and winning victories. It is coordinating nationally, raising political demands finally, and uniting around the idea that housing is a human right. A year ago, the Occupy movement launched a national day of action in a dozen cities, including Detroit, joining with families and groups, fighting to save homes. The Occupy movement has truly energized and spurred the growth of a national movement that is increasingly anti-capitalistic, direct action oriented, and definitely directed against the banks. And before I go further, I want to show you several slides that show you what we've gone through in Detroit. This is a typical neighborhood that's still intact. Most of the city looked like this. Next slide. The areas in red is an area in decay. Those are all, the circles are all empty houses now. They've been torn down after during the foreclosure crisis over the last 20 to 30 years. A lot of this, though, recently. And the third slide shows you the end result. These empty areas are not parkland. These are where working class homes used to be, and this is what low-tech, high-tech, low-pay gets you when you don't have resistance. It's utter destruction. Detroit is 143 square miles, about the size of Gaza, and over 40 square miles is now completely empty. Almost 1/3 of the city has been vacated. In the last 6 years, we've experienced somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 foreclosures. This is largely due to the racist subprime lending practices of the banks. The banks targeted largely African American and Latino communities in particular with the most expensive, lowest quality, but highly profitable subprime loans, which were almost impossible to pay off. In the last census, Detroit lost 250,000 people. That is where they left these areas, and we don't know where they went, but they're gone from the city of Detroit. And then the next slide, which is a more positive response. This is a demonstration we held last week after we stopped an eviction temporarily and then marched on Bank of America. This is about 100 people marching through a Detroit neighborhood that's still largely intact. In March of this year, we organized a national conference of anti-foreclosure activists. About 130 people came. They came from around the country and even as far away as Jerusalem, oddly enough, to build a movement to fight for a moratorium on foreclosures. One of the things that we did was send a bus all the way to Charlotte to demand a national moratorium on foreclosures. Next slide. And this is what we need to reinvigorate this demand. We want President Obama to declare a national moratorium on foreclosures. He can do it. He has the power to do it. He can declare war on Libya when he wants to without anybody else's authority. He can do something for the people. In early August, activists again met in Minneapolis. We attended the meeting, and the major point of that meeting, or major cause of concern, was the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the government takeover of the mortgage industry. They were taken over in 2008 and have received over almost $200 billion in bailout money. Not loans, but gifts from the American people to the banking industry. The meeting, and this is significant, the meeting called for regional actions attacking Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, followed by a national demonstration against Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And what was significant about this is that it was coordinated nationally. It brought together the housing rights movement to begin to fight in a more political way. They held, the most significant thing to me was the slogan was, "The people should take back the people's banks." In Detroit, with the rise of the Occupy movement, we were re-energized. We saved maybe a dozen homes in the last year, but we can't keep doing this. This is crazy. Every day there's some kind of anti-foreclosure action, and we can't sustain it. And that's why we need to get into this movement and demand that we fight for a national moratorium on foreclosures. And we need to do this just like the workers in Spain did. And we need to make this a part of a People's Power Assembly. There needs to be a housing component to this, because you lose your house because you lose your job. You lose your house because you have medical expenses that you can't afford. You lose your house because life is getting very difficult under this system. And one other point I'd like to make is that we're facing a severe austerity crisis in Detroit. And it's largely due to the foreclosure crisis, or in part. I mean, the governments are cutting back funding as well. But just last year, the city of Detroit lost $118 million in property taxes due to bank foreclosures that the banks abandoned. They decided they were no longer, after they kicked the people out of their houses, they were no longer going to pay the taxes, and the city of Detroit lost $118 million. And we did one other thing, and it was probably the first time that this has happened in the current crisis. We called for a demonstration against the banks in Detroit that called for a moratorium on the municipal debt. And to our surprise, we had 80 people come out representing a cross-section of the community. Activist ministers came, UAW members came, and they took our chant and turned it from a moratorium on the debt crisis to a cancellation of the debt. And and we need to pay attention to this, because it's a sign that maybe we need to step it up a bit. Fight for a moratorium on foreclosures, evictions, and public debt payments. Make the banks pay. Build the People's Power Assembly.